Hi there folks, members of the VC and anyone else watching. I'm Hedley and today I'm another fat bearded man talking about country rock. That's right, I've finally got my arse in gear and sorted this out. I've been promising to do this for ages. So I thought, well, I'll take the bull by the horns and let's just start it. So before I start, I'm going to have a little bit of a snifter because it's a celebration that I'm actually starting this video. This is a Junot Grand Almanac. I know nothing about it, and so I will toast you. This one's for you, Dean. I'll give it a go, let's see. I'm not a spirits guy. Yeah, I'll have some of that later. Right, so this first episode is more of a kind of a primer before I get on to the kind of the main deal of showing the records that I think I'm going to show. And I think first of all, before we sort of go headlong into country rock, is we need to kind of discuss what it is. So I mean, I've been doing a bit of research into this because clearly it seems to be a genre that's actually quite difficult to pin down, to describe. And it's kind of like that old adage, I don't know if you've heard it, when someone was asked, I think it was a judge was asked, what was pornography? He said, I don't know, but I know what it is when I see it. And country rock's a little bit like that. You don't quite know what it is, but when you hear country rock, you know you're hearing it. And there's a wide sort of catchment area, really, of what can be classed as country rock, and I will be discussing that as we go through the videos. But first of all, I just want to show you a couple of books that I've been reading in my preparing for this. The first one is Are You Ready for the Country by Peter Doggett, which is a great book, and if you haven't read it, it's really worth picking up and having a read. You've got all kinds of people. You've got Dylan on the cover there. It's got Elvis in here, Neil Young, of course, Graham Parsons, and all the various other people that you would expect to see. But it's well written, a good account of various forms and events, albums that were important in country rock. The other book that I have been reading is Desperados, The Roots of Country Rock by Jim Ineson. I actually prefer this book. This is a very kind of straightforward book. There's something kind of writerly about Peter Doggett's book. This is kind of more that I like. I just want the facts. Don't mess around with the prose and things like that. So what Ineson does is basically go through the kind of the important years chronologically. He starts in 1963. The first chapter is 1963 to 66. And then the sort of final hurrah is where it sort of talks about how the country rock bands were influential on more modern acts. So Desperados, The Roots of Country Rock by John Ineson. I would say that's a really good book to get if you want to know and find out a bit about the interconnectedness about country rock. And that's kind of what interests me. It's that interconnectedness of artists that were all guesting on each other's records, were standing in on stage and playing with each other during the late 60s and early 70s. Now, as James Griffiths, the vinyl professor, does, I've got some notes here. I'll try not to bury my head in them as I go through them. But what I've got here is basically, like I said, I want this to be a primer. First of all, we need to sort of approach the question of what is country rock. I mean, it's not something that's easy, as I said, but I mean, on a base level, it's something that developed in the late 60s, early 70s, with a blending of rock and country music in Southern California. But it's not really as simple as that. I mean, you've got to think that rock and roll itself is less of a genre and more of a melting pot. You know, it has the blues, rhythm and blues, jazz, gospel, western swing, country music, bluegrass, everything that kind of went into making rock and roll. So it's kind of difficult to kind of think about rock as a distinct entity away from the country. In many ways, you could say that actually rockabilly, which was like the birth kind of, if you think about Elvis and the Sun Records and the early rockabilly records that sort of came out, that in many ways was the first country rock. But as rockabilly migrated north across the Mason-Dixon line, it adapted and changed. It needed to fit in with the more urban areas in the cities like New York, and so it dumped the rural traditional roots that were there. They took the hillbilly out of rock and roll, which then of course means that later on it's an opportunity for the artists and musicians that would be known for the country rock movement to actually start putting it back into rock. But again, as I said, it's not as simple as that. What country rock isn't difficult to define. Mostly the musicians performed rock using country themes, the kind of the things that country music sung about, the subject matter, the vocal styles, the harmony parts of bluegrass and the harmony part singers like the Louvin brothers. That was taken. You've also got a move towards acoustic instrumentation. And also, of course, you have things like the pedal steel guitar being used considerably, and the fiddle in there as well. So that's kind of what it is. But in his book, John Einarsson identifies specifically 4 types or 4 genres or categories of country rock. The first being the one that's kind of long-haired rock musicians who were adapting country music but giving it a greater emphasis on rhythm, instilling it with more of a backbeat, giving it an attitude and rock sensibility. So they were doing country material but with a rock aesthetic. They were putting rock into country, country with rock textures, as it were. So that's the first one. The second one is musicians who would put country... Oh, sorry, I should say that the sort of artists that do that rock into country were artists like Graham Parsons and the work he would do with the Flying Burrito Brothers, also Nashville West. All of these things, all of these artists and bands we will come to in later episodes. Listen to me. Okay, so the second genre is this one where musicians are putting country into rock music. So they are rock bands, but what they're doing is they're bringing instruments from country music and putting rock with country textures. So bands like the early recordings of the Byrds, Poco did this, and Rick Nelson and the Stone Canyon Band. Again, bands and artists I'll look at later. Then the third group that Einarsson identifies is the folk and bluegrass artists that started to kind of get a feel for what was going on, and they themselves started to bring the country and the rock into their music. So you got more of a bluegrass flavour with your backbeats and rhythms that from rock and roll. So bands like the slightly more trippy Hearts and Flowers, the Dillards and Dillard and Clark. There we go. They would be that. They give that sort of bluegrass folk kick to it all. And then finally, the fourth genre that Einarsson identifies is the established rock artists, musicians who would flirt with country music. They are recording songs on their albums, or maybe even full albums in the country tradition. So a band like the Loving Spoonful that would have songs like Never Going Back to Nashville Anymore, or Nashville Cats. Buffalo Springfield, there would always be, and there always was, an element of them doing country music. not exclusively, of course. You know, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, while probably on the furthest reaches of country rock, the harmonies are very reminiscent of bluegrass and the close part harmony singing of country music and gospel. And then, of course, probably the most famous is Bob Dylan, more of which later. So there you go. Those are sort of some of the different... And this is why country rock is quite difficult to get a handle on. Got through that bit. Time for a drink. Well, I haven't shown a record yet. Oh dear, we're in trouble, aren't we? So, I want to go on from there and say how actually country rock developed. What were the conditions that led to it actually becoming something? And these again are a number of different reasons. And I should point out before I go on, I am not putting myself up as any expert on this at all. I've read a few books. I've listened to a few records. Well, quite a few records. But you know, with a lot of this, it's very open to interpretation, and I'm sure there will be people out there that totally disagree with me, and that's great. I like to have a bit of a duologue going of what this is. So if anyone wants to throw their 2 pennies within, I'd love to hear it. So what were the conditions that led to country rock? Well, okay, so the first one is the American folk revival. So the American folk revival sort of started in the 1940s, and it was American folk artists going back to their roots, and this would continue. And what happened was it was an antidote in the 60s, in the late 50s or into the 60s, where it had a kind of a second revival, and artists would get listeners to the radio were getting fed up of the blandness of music. Rock and roll had almost passed. It was almost something that had been big, and then it was a fad and it had gone. I mean, clearly we know that's not the case, but in terms of the radio, they were moving on from rock and roll. They were, you know, you had all your smooth crooners back again. It was almost as if rock and roll didn't happen. And so, looking for something completely different, the young music listeners started to turn to this folk music. It was almost like the punk of its day, I suppose. You know, it's that do-it-yourself aesthetic. And they would start to look to their roots and the traditional songs and sounds. And naturally, of course, there's a crossover between folk and country. I mean, they share some of the same songs in their repertoire. You know, things like Cumberland Gap. I mean, you're quite as likely to hear the Kingston Trio do a version of it as you would someone like Roy Acuff. So that connection between the folk and the country. Also, of course, it introduced people to the instruments, the banjo, the fiddle, dulcimers, things like that gave a more rural feel. So the young of that day had been primed. They started to kind of get some of that early country music through the folk genre. And many of the country rock kind of movers and shakers actually started out in this. Roger McGuinn, or Jim McGuinn as he was called at the time. I love the word. Do you know why he changed his name from Jim to Roger? Apparently, his guru, when he found one, I can't remember what the religion's called, a sort of a Far Eastern religion, and his guru said that his name beginning with J just wasn't good, and if he came up with a name with an R, it would vibrate better with the universe, and so Jim became Roger. He still kept Jim as a middle name, I think. Anyway, so yeah, so Roger McGuinn, he played with the Chad Mitchell Trio and with Judy Collins, and as a kind of a session player and live with them. Stephen Stills and Richie Furay, who were both in Buffalo Springfield and then would go on to other things. They played in a group called the Ogogo Singers in New York, in part of the sort of Greenwich coffee shop scene. Graham Parsons, he played with a group on the East Coast called the Shilohs. And again, they were a folk outfit. And Linda Ronstadt, probably most famously, she sang with a group called the Stone Ponies, and they were all folk artists that would then migrate to the country rock scene. Now, that was going fine, and then suddenly the British invasion of rock hit. The Beatles happened, and that changed everything. Suddenly all the kids that were listening to folk music suddenly found this new sound, this new music, this music that wasn't their parents' music, something that they could really get into. You know, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, other British acts that broke, the Animals, I suppose, the Hollies to some extent, Graham Nash was in them. And so fresh on this new take of rock and roll and blues, that influenced a generation of young Americans who might have had this folk element. Now they're being given something different. And I'll show you a record. Here we go. There we go. I should have put that at the beginning. So there we go. The Beatles. The British invasion shook everything up. Suddenly, all other music was not selling. And, of course, the Byrds were probably the first band that would try to be, and maybe even approach being, an American Beatles. So, yeah, the British invasion was an important factor. So what it meant was, you know, that new rock and roll, that new approach to rock and roll that the British invasion gave. You know, and it's kind of strange considering also, actually, you know, it kind of killed off that folk revival. But it's ironic that actually the British artists and bands were influenced by skiffle, a kind of a do-it-yourself version of American folk. So they were doing songs by Leadbelly, Woody Guthrie, and so, you know, of course, famously the Beatles started as the Quarrymen, as a skiffle group, and and so it's kind of ironic that they would then be the kind of catalyst for the folk revival kind of ending, really. So this new rock sound was important in the development, clearly, of a new rock music, which country and rock would be part of. Then the next big thing is a guy called Bob Dylan. I said I'd mention him earlier. Now, Bob Dylan was the arch folk music hero. You know, we know that there was that big to-do when he suddenly went electric, and so what he did with in 1966. Unfortunately, I don't have these on vinyl. He made Blood on the Tracks. Mm-hmm. Blood on the Tracks. What are you talking about? Blonde on Blonde. I don't think I should be drinking that. Right, so I was going to try to do this without any stupidness. I was going to try to do it straight down the middle, but I just seem being capable. So, 1966, Dylan is persuaded to go to Nashville to record Blonde on Blonde. And he wasn't really up for this to begin with, and he was sort of you know, they persuaded him to do it, and he went there, and basically he found a group of professional hot pickers and players in Nashville who were used to recording in a 3-hour session 4 songs. And of course, you know, that's not the way that Dylan really worked. Anyway, he said actually that the music that was produced for Blonde on Blonde actually came closest to the sounds that he could hear in his head, so what he wanted to do. So that was 66. Now that's not a country album. You know, there's not really anything there. But what it did was, I don't think you can underestimate how country music in the 60s was deemed in Nashville. It was seen by people as this hyper conservative form of music, and the society around it was equally conservative. Not always the case. There are chinks in the armour, but you know, that is in essence what it was. And so the idea of the kind of the protest singer, the arch folkie, going to Nashville to record a record was unheard of. And what it meant was, it meant that other people started seeing, well, if Dylan's done it, why can't we? So he then came back in 1968 with John Wesley Harding. Now this album does, again, recorded in Nashville, of course, and now this one is more rootsy, far more rootsy. Again, you wouldn't really call it country rock, but you know, it's getting there to the sort of sound that the band would be doing, and you know, it's solidified this idea of Nashville as being somewhere where more left field artists, folk artists, rock artists could record in Nashville, and that he basically was making Nashville cool. And then, of course, eventually, a year later in '69, he would record Nashville Skyline. Now, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't really call it country rock, but there are elements of it in here. And of course, you've got the duet with Johnny Cash, which, although they would like to say that it was a sort of two friends meeting up and just having a bit of a session together, it was highly organised. Both Columbia artists and top-selling Columbia artists, and the idea of both of them recording together looked like financial a dream for the finances. So yeah, so you've got fully fledged country music on here that Dylan has done, and again, if Dylan's doing country, well, we can do country. The next sort of condition under which the country rock was able to have a kind of a kickstart was the Bakersfield sound. Now, the Bakersfield sound. Bakersfield is a town east of LA, and it came about because at the time in the 1950s, the prevalent sound for country music was the overproduced Nashville sound, or would later become countrypolitan, the smooth, your Jim Reeves, Eddie Arnold. That was making a killing, and those were the records that were selling. But there were artists that kind of went, I don't want any part of this. So they moved towards Bakersfield, and a music started that came out of the sort of honky-tonk bars. Again, it relates back to the early days of the honky-tonk bands. And it replaced the acoustic guitar that country music was using with electric instruments. So, famously, the Fender Telecaster, which was actually originally designed for country musicians, but apparently the fretboard wasn't good enough really for people to pick on. Anyway, so they would use the Fender Telecaster, and they again would add a bit of backbeat to it, a bit of R&B kind of rhythm. In many ways, again, there's a lot of people, Chris Hillman and other people, say that the Bakersfield sound was for them an early country rock. And if you listen to it, yeah, you can definitely hear it there. So, of course, if you don't include rockabilly as being the first, and so what we had, I'll show some records. One of the first to come out, Win Stewart, sort of proto Bakersfield sound. He put in the early work. He was the one that was sort of introducing the electric instruments, adding that backbeat. So Win Stewart there, a nice suit as well. Can't help but think about the Flying Burrito Brothers when you see him there, can you? Then it kind of, I suppose, the king of the Bakersfield sound, Buck Owens. And Buck Owens really took it to other places, and he was a the Beatles were a huge fan of Buck Owens. Of course, they cover Act Naturally on, I don't know which album. Sorry, I want to say Revolver. It's not Revolver. What are you on about? Anyway, so Buck Owens and his Buckaroos, and yeah, he was a big fan of the Beatles as well, and in fact, he would go on to record a number of their songs. Certainly, Lady Madonna, he did. So that was an interesting thing of the Beatles being influenced by the Bakersfield sound. And there are a number of other Beatles songs that although are not covers, actually have that Bakersfield sound to them on some of their earlier albums. So the wonderful Buck Owens. And then, of course, you get Merle Haggard. Merle Haggard, who died last year, unfortunately. He didn't die last year, he died the year before. And this is Merle Haggard and the Strangers, and he just kind of updated it for the 60s. Really kind of pushed it, and would take the Bakersfield sound and probably make it more popular than even Buck Owens managed. So there you go. So that is the Bakersfield sound, which all of the country rock artists sort of say was an influence. You know, they were playing the clubs in and around LA, so they would see them playing them. The last thing I kind of want to talk about really is the club scene, which really helped the country rock movement to network, share or steal ideas from each other. New York had the New York. New York had the New York. Of course it did. The New York, yeah. But New York had the coffee shop, the folk scene, the Greenwich Village coffee shops. And in some ways, the country rock network of nightclubs in and around LA, in Southern California, kind of acted a little bit like the Greenwich Village folk club scene. Although, as as it's been pointed out, you had to drive from club to club. So these clubs, as I said, would be a meeting point where people would play with each other. They would get up on stage and help out each other. People would see people playing and say, "Hey, do you want to play on my album?" So it was a real opportunity for them to learn from each other, network, and become a cohesive group. And that is one of the things that I find interesting with the early days of country rock. This interconnectedness that I think I talked about earlier. This idea that there's a sharing, that actually a lot of the bands kind of blend into each other and help each other out. And that's one of kind of the themes that's going to be working through the rest of the videos I do. So some of the clubs, probably the most famous would be the Troubadour. And the Troubadour was it was important to really both the country rock artists and those artists that would become the southern kind of rock, not southern rock, the Californian sound, the Laurel Canyon crowd, which of course there is that crossover there as well. And so the Troubadour is probably the one place where all these bands, these artists would meet up, watch each other. Other ones was the Ash Grove. The Ash Grove was often jokingly referred to as the West Coast University for folk music, in that it was one of the early folk clubs, and it was where the young folkies in LA and around Hollywood would go They would do folk and blues, and the bluegrass artists. In fact, I think it was Doug Dillard said that, or at least certainly a member of the Dillards, said that it was very much a split down the middle. You had the bluegrass people on one side and the folkies on the other side, and never the twain shall meet. And it was a very progressive establishment. It was the way it was run. It had a kind of quite left-wing management. They also provided venue for world music, so people like Ravi Shankar and Miriam Makeba made their American debuts at the Ash Grove. And the girls, this is where they all hung out, and people like Chris Hillman and Clarence White, who started in bluegrass bands, Bernie Ledden. I say Ledden. I've heard someone say Leeden, but I'm probably going to say Ledden through these videos. And they were all at the Ash Grove. Another one that was important was the Palomino, and that was a country club. Not a country club, it was a club that did country music. And originally it was a very working class bar. It was the type of place that opened at 6 in the morning and had a happy hour between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. Oi! Time for another drink. No. And like I said, it was best known as being a country music venue. So all the people, as we saw earlier, Wynne Stewart, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard would all have played there and would be seen by the musicians and artists that would create country rock. By the 70s, they started letting in long hairs and letting the bands that were this sort of, I suppose, that country rock start to actually play there as well. So you have bands like the Flying Burrito Brothers playing at the Palomino. And also it would later become a kind of a hub for the cowpunk scene in the 80s. And finally, I suppose one of the other ones is the Whiskey A Go-Go, famous for where go-go dancing came from. And that was originally only it was a discotheque, but also they would have bands on before the music would start. And they very much had country rock musicians that would play there. So really, that's kind of all I want to say in this first one. That hopefully kind of sets the scene for what country rock is and how it came about. Now, what I'm doing with this is clearly I don't have every country rock record under the sun. But what I'm trying to do with this, as I said, this interconnectedness is something that interests me. And so what I'm going to be doing with this kind of collection of videos is focusing on artists and bands that are related to and can trace their ancestry back to two groups, the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, because between those two bands practically everyone that was involved in the country rock movement has some connection, played with, went on to form another band from, all those types of things. So those are the two. I mean, actually, I suppose when I first came up with this, I was influenced by the rock family trees. And there is a rock family tree for the sort of Southern Californian country rock with the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield. But I've also interested in the chronological nature of when the albums were released, because you can put, I don't know, the Flying Burrito Brothers album next to a Poco album next to the Eagles, and you know perhaps when dates they were released, but when were they released in the year? What were influenced by other bands or other records. So I'm going to be kind of blending a bit of that chronological run through from the kind of mid 60s, where a lot of the bands, a lot of the artists were playing in folk and bluegrass groups, through the kind of the crucible of country rock, and even up through into the 80s and dare I say 90s. But clearly I'm going to be focusing on the sort of the 67 to 75. That sort of period is going to be the main body of these videos. So I'm looking forward to showing more records in the next video. This has probably gone on interminably, and I apologise for that. But I wanted to get something out there. Hopefully you've learned something from this. I know I have. So the next one will be, as I said, starting in the sort of mid-60s and then moving through from there and see how far we get. Okay, so until I see you for the second part of this country rock opus, no, this country rock series, I will say bye-bye for now.